Welcome to the Skagit Land Trust online speaker series. My name is Sarah Gardam. I'm an outreach coordinator with the trust. Tonight's talk is our fifth speaker series talk, and we're going to be learning how to better read the Skagit landscape, thanks to our guest, who is local geologist Dan McShane. Dan does a lot of consulting work for us. His business, Stratum Group, is a business supporter of the Skagit Land Trust, and we're very grateful for their generosity in that regard. And we've been working with Dan for quite a while. And I think, um, everyone, I noticed a lot of the staff are turning out for this one, and um, we have a lot of guests. So I wanted to quickly say that we should start by remembering that the lands we're going to talk about tonight have been inhabited and stewarded by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. They've known these landscapes for much longer than most of us, and we are very grateful for their ongoing protection and stewardship of the lands and waters surrounding us here in the Skagit. A few of you might be new to Skagit Land Trust, so I'll just mention that we're an accredited nonprofit land trust started in 1992. And it was started by a group of people who really saw into the future and saw what kind of pressures would be on the Skagit in terms of development and threatening the loss of a lot of special natural areas and features of the landscape. So our mission is to conserve wildlife habitat, wetlands, agricultural and forest lands, scenic open space, and shorelines for the benefit of the community and as a legacy for future generations. We have helped protect over 11,500 acres here in the Skagit. You can see a nice photo of our staff here. Just kidding, that's some elk, but and then I wanted to introduce Dan McShane next. So Dan is president and senior geologist at Stratum Group, a geology and environmental consulting company based in Bellingham. He has been reading the Washington State landscapes he said since 1970, when he was driving around the Horseheaven Hills with his father and brother. But his observations are published on his blog, so I really encourage people to check that out. And with that, I think I'm gonna turn it over to Dan. So I'll stop sharing my screen and you can go ahead and share, Dan.
How's it look? It come up okay?
I can see it.
Okay, so yeah, the title is reading the Skagit landscape. And before I begin, when I got asked to do this, I was very glad to. Skagit Land Trust is just a wonderful organization, and we've been really happy to work with them for many, many years. And I gave a talk about 2 years ago where it took place in Skagit County, and I left the mountains out entirely because they're so complicated. But I decided to take a crack at them this time, and hopefully you'll come away with a little bit better understanding of the incredible landscape that we live in, and we're very fortunate to be living in this part of the world. So if there's a few things I'd like you to kind of come away with is an understanding of what accreted terrains are and how that relates to the Skagit Mountains and islands. And then a little bit about current tectonics. That's how mountains form and the landscape that we live in. And then finally, also understanding the glacial shaping of Skagit County. We were covered by almost 5,000 feet of ice. So that's had a profound impact on why Skagit County looks the way it does. And then kind of wrap up at the end with a little bit about the dynamic geology here. We're not in a static landscape by any means. There's a lot going on, including some hazards, which people sometimes like to talk about, but I'll just touch on them briefly at the end. So I thought I'd just give a quick summary, maybe a reminder if you've ever not seen this before, about plate tectonics, and that is that the Earth is made up of a bunch of plates that are moving around. And we are right up here where my cursor is, where this Juan de Fuca plate, this little tiny ocean plate off our coast that is sliding under North America. Um, and so all these plates are moving, and so the Earth's surface itself, everything's moving around. And if you give it a long enough time, they've moved remarkably long distances. So if we go way back in time, uh, well over 1 billion years ago, North America used to we give it a name called Laurentia, and it was jammed together. This ID with a star in it means Idaho. Washington State didn't exist. It wasn't part of North America because Washington State wasn't there. None of the land that makes up Washington State existed. What was off the coast of Idaho was Australia. And then a little bit to the south was Antarctica. So it just gives you a sense that things have been moving around on Earth for a long time. Eventually, Australia broke away and went out into the ocean. Got to do something like my plug here. And so this is what North America would have looked like roughly 200 million years ago. You had the coastline of North America, and then it was ocean, maybe a shallow ocean, or Idaho, and now eastern Washington lies. And then this is an image for about 152 million years ago. And this is when things really started to get a lot of action along our coastline and the beginning of the formation of Washington State. And that was what happened was that the Africa and Europe broke away from North America. So the opening up of the Atlantic, so it's a very narrow Atlantic Ocean at that time, but that resulted in North America moving westward over this much larger Pacific Ocean at that time. And so as North America moved westward, it started to collide with things. And the ocean floor dove down underneath North America, creating a volcanic arc. There were faults, earthquakes, and stuff started getting added on to the edge of North America. And so we have here is an older accreted terrain, which would have been like a island arc, something like Japan, that would have collided with North America and was added on to our shoreline. And then another terrain, this is kind of a nondescript one, and there were many terrains that came in that slammed into North America and were added on. And so these are the term that some people use as exotic terrains. So they were not part of North America, but they were out in the ocean and got added on to the edge of North America and built up what is now Washington State over time. This map was produced by the DNR, and it showed just kind of, here's the oldest rocks. So that's the old edge of North America is on the right-hand side. And then you have all these terrains, the Kootenai terrain, Quesnel terrain, Swakane terrain, and they just added on the Chelan Mountains terrain. So that's in the North Cascades. The Nason terrain is also in the North Cascades. And then near us in western Skagit County, also part of the Cascade Ranges, you have the Northwest Cascade terrains, a melange belt, which basically means there are just a whole bunch of terrains all piled up together, and it's been hard to figure out what terrain belongs to what. And it's continued beyond what's part of Skagit County. You have the crescent terrain, which is a big ocean floor block that is slammed into Washington State. And ongoing, the Ozette terrain, which is the core of the Olympic Mountains. And then another relatively recent ocean floor terrain called the Hoh terrain has been added on as well. And this crescent terrain plays a role in the mountain building of the Cascades, because when it collided, that caused a lot of deformation in this area as well. So it's just been an ongoing kind of you can think of it almost as a bulldozer with the blade just barely off the ground, getting stuff piled up against it as it drives along. And that's North America, things added on to it. So this is a little bit of a closer map of our local terrains. And so Skagit County is where my cursor is kind of laying down there. Uh, there's Guaymas Island, Samish Island is right about here, and then the Skagit Valley goes up into this area. And there's one structure that's really important in our local geology is this dark black line. It's called the Straight Creek Fraser River Fault. It's a fault line that things moved approximately 100 miles along this fault line. And so it juxtaposes some very different rocks on this side of the fault, the east side of the fault with the west side of the fault. The fault line runs roughly through Marble Mount in a north-south direction. So when you cross that fault line, you move from the Northwest Cascades into what we call the crystalline core of the North Cascades. These are highly deformed rocks that were under really high pressure and high temperatures over time, roughly 90 million years ago. Which brings me to my introduction to Skagit County. I worked with up at Western Washington University under the tutelage of Ned Brown, who was doing a lot of work in the Northwest Washington. And this particular rock was a rock I was always looking for. And geologists can get a story out of an individual rock. And I got pretty excited when I found a rock with this assemblage of minerals. This whitish mineral is called kyanite. And right here, there's a mineral that was called andalusite, but it's changed to kyanite. And so that tells me a story that it went from a high temperature to a really high pressure, which is what formed the kyanite. And then these little red things are garnets. And you can extract pressure, temperature stuff out of the garden. So this is back in my glory days as a graduate student, was the result of finding that rock is that I had a garnet that came in at a very relatively low pressure. It was buried about 5 kilometers or 5 miles below the surface of the earth. And then when it changed over to the kyanite, it meant that rock got buried almost 20 miles below the surface. And so when you drive up the Skagit Valley and cross over from at Marble Mount to the east, you're looking at rocks in that area that have been buried as much as 20 miles below the surface of the earth. So it's a little trivia thing that you can get out of it, but that was something that was a hard fought battle to get these rocks and come up with a story. And I just thought I'd just touch on a few other kind of unique features besides the 20-mile burial. This is the image of the twin sisters, which get a view of from the Skagit Valley. I used to tell my daughter and her friends that all I wanted to know about the geology of the twin sisters is the twin sisters are made out of dunite. And she's been really good at remembering that. And then she tells her friends that. So what's dunite? Well, dunite is this kind of dark green rock. It weathers this orange rim around it. So that's why the twin sisters have this kind of orangish color, although most of the minerals are green. It's a piece of the mantle, which is really unusual to have a chunk of the mantle up on the surface of the earth. And it's probably the second or third largest block of mantle rock in the world. So it's a pretty rare thing. And then we've got a whole mountain range made out of the mantle of the earth sticking up in our neck of the woods. And that's all part of this accretion terrain collision that somehow a chunk of the mantle got caught up in the collision and thrust up on top of the Earth's surface. I just like to show this as a lot of people go down south to the southwest in the Grand Canyon area. This is Petrified Forest National Park. And you look at these really old rocks that are nice and layered, and they really have quite the story to be told. And so these are Jurassic Age rocks, nicely layered. And so we have a lot of Jurassic Age rocks in the Northwest Cascades and in the North Cascades. So this is a view of some of our Jurassic rocks. And you can see why it might be challenging to figure out and understand these rocks. They're covered with forest. And so the exposures are pretty limited. And then on top of that, they're really mangled up. And so instead of horizontal, they're twisted and bent. sticking up vertically. And even at the small scale, you can see how mangled up the rock is. It's just these really tight folds and little fault lines cutting through the rock. This is the Darrington Phyllite, which is a formation that makes up most of Blanchard Mountain. And then back to the Straight Creek Fault. The important thing to think about with the Straight Creek Fault is it offset the crystalline core of the Cascades. So this is the North Cascades that are in, up by Marble Mount, the core of when you drive up Highway 20, you'll drive through these rocks. But notice they're way above the Washington state border. And so they're really part of the Coast Plutonic Complex of British Columbia, but they slid southward, or more likely, things to the west of the fault slid northward. And so the Cascades are now down here. So it's been offset by that major fault. So when we go into the crystalline core of the Cascades, you're really looking at the core of the Coast Plutonic Complex of the Coast Range of British Columbia. Then I just one other small thing that is really kind of mind-bending. This is a geologic map showing there's the Straight Creek Fault, the Chelan Block, which is part of that crystalline core, the root of the Coast Range. There's the Wenatchee Block, which is also part of that. And then you have over here the Northwest Cascades and these lower grade rocks. But I circled this little TS, and then down here there's another TS. These are younger rocks that are not metamorphosed, and they were deposited when the Cascade Range actually was gone for a while. So around 60 million years ago, there must have been a lot of erosion, and the sediment that formed these rocks, which is the Chuckanut Formation that you see when you drive up Chuckanut Drive. This is over here is the Bolson Creek Formation, which is just south of Mount Vernon. That sediment came from the Okanagan Highlands and was deposited in this area when the mountains didn't exist. And he probably actually covered this entire area, but when the Cascades uplifted again, it's all been eroded away. So a lot of it's been missing. And this is just a map of just the Chuckanut Formation. And you can see there's the Straight Creek Fault. On the other side of the fault, here's the Swakane Formation, which is the exact same age, has the same affinity. So it's sediment that went over the top, and then it's been offset by the Straight Creek Fault. So just little patchy bits of this Chuckanut Formation, and it's kind of a lot of missing information because of all the erosion that's taken place. And there's the case of Marble Mount right there along the Straight Creek Fault. And then I just kind of want to wrap up, maybe for geologists and tectonic people like that are interested in me, is like there is a huge debate that's been taking place for many years. There's a professor at Western named Merle Beck who studied paleomagnetism, which is where you get the magnetism off of rocks and you can figure out where they were on the Earth at one time. And he looked at the paleomag for Mount Stewart batholith, which is the Mount Stewart area near Ellensburg. And that's within the crystalline core of the Cascade Range. And he came up with a paleo latitude that those rocks used to be down at the latitude of Baja, Mexico. And so there's this term you'll hear amongst geologists who talk about the North Cascades and basically the entire western Cordilleran of North America. Use the term Baja BC. That is that the rocks from Baja got shifted all the way up into British Columbia. And so the rocks we're seeing in British Columbia used to be just off the coast of Baja. That's not a totally for sure thing. There's another argument that they only came from this area about the Oregon-California border. And then there's some people who say that they didn't come from anywhere. But it's an ongoing issue that we're trying to figure out. I kind of lean toward being in the Baja BC camp for a variety of reasons, but I certainly that's just my interpretation based on a lot of other people's really hard work. But most of our recent landscape has been shaped by glaciers. And our last glacial incursion was between 19,000 and 14,000 years ago in Skagit County. It's called the Fraser Glaciation or the Vashon Stade, named after Vashon Island. So glacial ice advanced out of British Columbia from the high coast range and extended all the way down past Olympia. So it filled in the entire lowland area and went out the Strait of Juan de Fuca. In the Skagit County area, the ice was about 5,000 feet thick. And before the ice came, it's kind of interesting. The ice age had already started before the glacial ice advanced into Puget Sound and out the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And sea levels were lower, and so the outer coast was much further out. If you were around at that time, you'd be able to walk out to the San Juan Islands from Skagit County because the sea level was so much lower, because so much water and the oceans were caught up in glacial ice. So the ice that came out of British Columbia was kind of late stages of the ice age before it would really advance down all the way. I took this picture flying over Greenland, and it kind of gives you an example. As you had this big ice field up in British Columbia, and then a tongue of ice that extend way out into the lowlands and even into the ocean. So it's kind of an analog to what things might have looked like in Skagit County at that time. And then as the ice advances, it's advancing down into Puget Sound, it would have blocked the outlet of Puget Sound, so some big lakes would have formed. And then oddly, the glacial ice actually moved up the Skagit Valley from down valley. So it moved from west to east as that Puget ice lobe advanced into the area 18,000 years ago. And another factor that thick ice is the ice was so heavy and so massive, 5,000 feet thick, it actually pushed the land surface downward. So we had 5,000 feet of ice here, and then the land surface would have been pushed down hundreds of feet by that thick ice. It was sitting on top of us. And as it advanced, it would create this kind of depression in front of the ice as it advanced, where because of the pressure of the ice behind it. So the land surface is being changed by just the mass of the ice. The term for that is called isostasy. So the glacial ice advanced. One of the things is that ice is melting as it's advancing, and it's melting back, and you have large rivers. So up here, you got a large river coming out along the one side of the ice, another large river coming out here, and then there's water flowing down underneath the ice as well. And you can see in the bay here, all this mud and sediment. And so this is what the Skagit Valley area, or the Skagit, where most people live in the lower part of Skagit County, was experienced was a lake setting or a tidal ocean setting with all this mud and sediment being delivered by the meltwater from the glaciers. And so what that looks like is that when the glacier was pretty far away, you have real quiet water where it's going to be silt and clays. And then as the ice got closer, you have much higher fast flowing water with carrying sand and gravel and ripped up blocks of sediment as well. It's another kind of view of the same thing. You see this very finely layered silts and clays deposited probably in a lake that was fronting the glacier. And then as the glacier got closer, you had the sand and gravel being deposited on top of that old lake deposit. And this is a pretty classic sequence of sediment that you see through from Skagit County all the way down to Olympia. We have these lake deposits, and then on top of it, sand and gravel sitting abruptly on top of the silt clay. And then when the glacier finally got us and covered us in areas that would deposit stuff directly underneath the glacial ice, and it's almost like concrete. The thickness of that ice, we got 5,000 feet of ice, that's going to press down and compact that silt clay, make it really hard. And the glacier's carrying a lot of rocks and pebbles, sometimes boulders. And so you get this cement-like feature called glacial till. We live on Samish Island, Lisa and I, and whenever I try to plant anything in this glacial till that we have, I have to get a pickaxe out to dig a hole to get a plant put in it. It's nutrients rich soil, but it's very hard and difficult to dig in. This is not our property, but this is another place where somebody had been collecting the boulders as they were trying to have a pasture, and they would dig up these rocks and they piled them up. These are termed glacial erratics, and most of them, if you look at them carefully, mostly granite. And so those rocks were derived from British Columbia Coast Range and deposited in Skagit County. And then at the maximum ice extent, this is what things might have looked like. I got an arrow pointing to where Bellingham is. So Skagit County is in this area here, completely covered by ice. The ice lobe came down and extended all the way to Olympia. Another lobe went all the way out to the Strait of Juan de Fuca and out into the ocean. The ice started getting so thick that, as I mentioned before, glacial ice was flowing up the Skagit Valley, but then the glacial ice actually overtopped almost all the high peaks of the North Cascades and came down the Skagit Valley, and the two ice fields met. Ice continued on down into the Lake Chelan area, and then you've got the Eastern Washington, the Okanagan lobe, and the Pend Oreille lobe of ice that extended down the area. It's just a map showing what the extent of glacial ice based on, kind of markers out in the field that people have recognized over the years. So Seattle was under ice. Tacoma, we're way up here, buried even deeper. And then you also seeing that the glacial ice going up these different valleys. And then what did that ice look like? And so this is another kind of analog is to look at Greenland late in the summer, and the Greenland ice sheet, it's not all white and pristine. It's got a lot of rock and dust and dirt in it. It's also melting. And so you get these lakes, and then that water from the melt, actually, where does it go? It doesn't flow off the ice, and it will flow down underneath the ice. And so the ice certainly does some carving and shaping of the land, but the water flowing under the ice plays even a larger role and actually scoured out Puget Sound by water under ice water flowing. You think of it, it's water under pressure from high up on the ice sheet flowing down underneath it, channeling out a lot of sediment as it flowed underneath the Puget lowlands and under Skagit County as well. Then just have, this is kind of close up of what the ice age or the ice margin might have looked like as it was advancing over the area. So this is the Skagit Valley here. As the ice advanced up, it would have created a lake, would have dammed the Skagit River. This is the Stillaguamish River through here. It was dammed, and so it was a lake formed back behind it. The Sauk River comes down, and it was also blocked. And so this whole area of water backed up in. Eventually, the glacier ice covered this whole area over as it came down from the north. But then as the ice retreated, you still had these blocked off areas. And so what the result of that is you ended up with a lot of sediment trapped in the upper part of the Skagit Valley and the upper part of the Stillaguamish Valley and the Sauk Valley, leaving these big terraces or elevated areas in the upper part of the Skagit. This is the Malaspina Glacier up in Alaska. And so again, capturing kind of what a glacier that's retreating. And you can see how dirty the outer edges are. And there's actually places on the Malaspina Glacier where there's trees growing on the glacial ice. The ice is underneath. There's so much, it's been uh, got so much dirt on it that things start to grow on the ice itself. And a close-up look of that, the glacier, you can see that you have this vegetation growing on the glacier, but it's then full of these pock marks because as the glacier underneath this vegetation melts, you end up with these big divots, and we call these kettles. And you go up the Skagit Valley, this is just downstream of where the Sauk River enters the Skagit River. There's a big kettle field where these big divots in the ground that were the result of ice that was buried. It melted out and then left a collapse feature. And then there's a pretty good gravel rich area, and so there's a gravel mine right here. And then this little mound here is actually a landfill that Skagit County used to operate. This is what a kettle field looks like. This is not in Skagit County. It's actually up in Whatcom County, where you have these collapse features, and sometimes there'll be these little lakes that form inside them. Nice feature, but they're scattered all over the Puget Lowlands in different spots, and over in eastern Washington too, where there's been ice that's melted and left behind these depressions. And I just want to re-emphasize this again because at the end, we're talking about the glacial ice retreating, or it's not so much retreating, it just melts in place and leaves behind a lot of debris and junk. But because that ice was here, it had lowered the land surface down, as I said, hundreds of feet because of the massive ice. And so at the end of the ice age, glacial ice is melted out of Skagit County, but because the land surface was under so much weight of that ice, this is maybe a pretty good idea of what Skagit County might have looked like 12,000 years ago. Everything was underwater. So Mount Vernon is right about here, was underwater. This is the Bayview area. It was completely submerged, the hill where the airport is. Samish Island was completely underwater as well. And then once the ice weight was off, the land started to rebound. It's the real subtle features, but you see them on Bayview Hill, and this is on Samish Island. See this curvy, these are the old shorelines. As the land rebounded, you had a little bit of wave action that reworked things. And I live on Samish Island, and I can't see these on the ground, but the LiDAR imagery, which is a imagery that we can get on very detailed ground surface, you can see that there's these just slight terraces and wave cut terraces around the perimeter of the island. And then another main kind of a big deal for Skagit County was that when the glacier ice was melting out of the area, it really hung up in the Bellingham area in Whatcom County for a fairly long period of time. At least on the order of 50, maybe 100 years or so. And the reason it had a big impact is up here, these blue lines, it's the Chilliwack River, and it flowed out. It was blocked by the glacial ice. And so it flowed down a valley that's up in Whatcom County. It's called the Columbia Valley. There's no river there now, but that's where the Chilliwack River flowed. The Nooksack River is coming out. This is where the Nooksack River enters the Whatcom County lowlands. It was blocked by the ice as well. And so this river then flowed south through the South Fork of the Nooksack River Valley, what is today the South Fork of the Nooksack River Valley, and headed towards Skagit County. And this is its outlet into Skagit County, is a sinuous, deep channel. And there is a river there now. It's the Samish River. But the Samish River is a pretty small river, and there's no way the Samish River carved this deep valley. The other factor of this valley is that it was a very major river. And then as it flowed down and got to the lowlands, this is Interstate 5, and you're going up, leaving the Skagit Flats and then heading up toward Whatcom County. You go up a hill here. This is the delta of that river was deposited in here. And it's a blessing for some of us. It's a source of a really good source of gravel because you have this big river and this big delta deposit. And so there's quite a few gravel mines in this old delta deposit. And then you get to the Samish and Skagit Flats. And when I drive home and I get off the exit at Conway, and there's a roundabout there and it says, welcome to Skagit Valley. And I really wish they would just call it the Skagit Delta, because if you're in Cedar Woolley and up above that, that's certainly the Skagit Valley, but the rest is really a delta. And this kind of gives you a sense of how this delta is proceeding. So if we went back in time, say 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, Skagit River comes flowing down and it's flowing into the sea. Most of western Skagit County was below sea level. And the Skagit River Delta is filling in and dumping sediment and building its delta outward. And so you can sort of see the orange and yellow is where sediment is deposited. Right now, the Skagit River flows south through Mount Vernon and heads down this way. But it used to flow over here, and you can see this big lobe of sediment that was deposited by an older version of the Skagit River that was flowing more toward the north, out toward Samish Island and the north side of Bayview. And it just gives you over time how the delta has expanded and filled in all this area with sediment adjusted with it's called a digital elevation. And this is a picture of one of the old channels of the Skagit River. And these channels, this is the Joe Leary Slough, and it's been partially filled in because once the channel got abandoned during big floods, silt and logs would get dumped in this slough and gradually filled up the old channel. So it doesn't look like a big river channel anymore, but it's sort of the remnants of the former river channel that cut across this area. And so we have a lot of these old channels. They're pretty faint in some places. The Joe Leary Slough is one of the larger ones that's a little bit more evidence. So if you're driving over that way, it gives you a better idea what it looks like. Then I have one more of the delta here. It's built out. And then these blue areas on the Skagit, or this is the Samish Flats. These are areas that are actually below sea level. And then you have this ditch system that are draining the delta. And that's really important for the farmland in Skagit County. Unfortunately, sometimes when the rivers flood or we have a tremendous amount of rain, the water fills in behind the dikes that are keeping the seawater out. So Samish Island in the distance, Lummi Island sticking up behind, and water from during a flood on the Samish River. So the drainage systems are really important in the Skagit Valley and the Skagit Delta here, where this is a pump that pumps water out of the fields so that they can be worked and farmed. And while I was taking a picture of that, the pump system, this is a little bit of a trivia thing that I like to compare mountains to the Grand Tetons. This, there's Mount Baker here, but this, what really should be called a mountain, but it's called Lyman Hill. Lyman Hill is over 4,000 feet high, and the elevation change from the bottom of Lyman Hill to the summit is almost 4,000 feet, which competes fairly well with the Grand Teton, which has about a 6,000 foot change from the valley floor to the summit. And so it's always kind of good to remind just how much elevation change. Our mountains are pretty abrupt how they rise up over a short distance and rise up above us. Then back to the delta sequence and what's going on with the Skagit Delta. This is from the United States Geological Survey. They estimated the amount of sediment coming down the Skagit River on an annual basis, and so they give it a big fat arrow because it's got a lot of sediment coming down it. You can see the Nooksack River up here. It's got a pretty good size, even though it's a small river, a lot of sediment coming down. And then the other big one is the Puyallup River. And it's not as large as the Skagit, but why do these rivers have such large amounts of sediment coming out of them? Well, if you go up the Skagit River Valley, there's a lot of glaciers. And so that glacier outwash and melting of the glaciers in the mountains is providing a tremendous amount of sediment that comes down the Skagit Valley and then into filling in that delta. And it will, over time, fill in, and Whidbey Island will not be an island anymore. It'll fill the entire area in behind it. And there's pretty good evidence that before the last ice age, that most of Puget Sound was filled in with sediment from these river systems flowing in and then recarved by the water flowing underneath the glacial ice. But there's another source of sediment. This mountain sticking up here is Glacier Peak. And I sometimes like to call it the sneaky volcano because it's not as easy to see as, say, Mount Baker and Mount Rainier, sort of hiding back there in the North Cascades, but there are places where you can see it. And Glacier Peak is a pretty active volcano, and it has had impacts on Skagit County, even after the Ice Age, where mud flows coming off of the mountain during either volcanic events or volcanic eruptions, or during high heat flow that causes chunks of the mountain to collapse and have these lahars move down the mountain and flow down. And there are areas where there's sediment underneath the delta that is made up of mud that came off of Glacier Peak. And so it's kind of interesting to think about Glacier Peak could do something like that again. It would be pretty disruptive to the Skagit County area. And we don't have any evidence. This is Lake Shannon going up toward Mount Baker, of any mud flows that have come off Mount Baker. But that's probably because most of the evidence was destroyed by the last ice age. There are mud flows that have gone off from Mount Baker that have gone toward the north down the Nooksack River, but we don't have any evidence of anything that has come down into the Skagit since the last ice age. I'm not quite ready to wrap up, but this is, we've given a lot of talks. I like to kind of end with this, as it makes geologists proud, and that civilization exists by geologic consent, subject to change without notice. And Will Durant was a historian, and I think might have been somewhat inspired by looking at places in Europe that had been buried by volcanic eruptions and the abrupt changes that would occur. I like to think that we do now have some understanding that we have some notice regarding the geologic conditions, and that if we pay attention to them, maybe we can take actions appropriately. And that maybe fits in with kind of the dynamic landscape that we have in Skagit County and some of the hazards that we might have to think about. So a little bit back to the plate tectonics. This is our kind of our current situation. There's this Juan de Fuca plate, which is moving toward generally toward the southeasterly direction, and then North America plate moving in a westward direction. And so that creates this big subduction plate boundary. This is what we call the Cascadia Fault. So here's the fault line. And the last time we had a really big fault was an earthquake on the Cascadia Fault was in 1700. Deeper down, there are other deep faults that have taken place that have also been damaging, and they're a little bit more common. There was one in 1949. There's one in 1965, and I did have a client in Skagit County who said their pool broke in two during that earthquake. And then there was one in 2001 called the Nisqually quake. And that was a pretty good shake. It caused a fair bit of damage in the Auburn area and in Olympia. And so we have that potential risk of those quakes. And then there's other earthquakes in the area as well that maybe aren't as well understood. Besides the Cascadia fault, we also have a fault that cuts right through just south of Mount Vernon. It's the Darrington Devils Mountain Fault Zone. There's another fault zone through Whidbey Island. The Darrington Devils Mountain Fault Zone is definitely has a mark on the ground. And this is a LiDAR image of the fault. This is a Big Lake. And then just south of Big Lake, you can see the scar, a couple scars cutting across the landscape. This is where the Darrington Devils Mountain Fault cuts across the area. And it's recently, as a paper came out about 8 or 9 years ago, and they found that it actually offset glacial deposits and has the potential for, pretty good sized quake. We don't know how big, and it's not fully understood, but it's certainly an active fault and some additional movement to occur along it as well. And back to the Cascadia fault, people live in the Delta, you may be seeing the signs of, entering the tsunami hazard zone or leaving the tsunami hazard zone. And so this is a map that the Department of Natural Resources put out where they modeled a tsunami coming in from the earthquake on the Cascadia fault out in the Pacific coast, and how high or deep the water would get, and estimated at the Edison Bow Fire Department 3.1 feet. So it's a little better than a lot of other places. And I had a project where I had to kind of deliver the news, the model that, and also we had some evidence with the water. It was actually 30 feet deep out on the Olympic Peninsula. So we're not so bad here, although it certainly would be disruptive if we had the tsunami come in. Area. And then this more in the south part of the Delta, Highway 20 coming across toward Anacortes. Yes, Highway 20 would be under about 3 feet of water in this area here. And then you don't have to get a tsunami to have flooding on the Delta, and so refer to this as the perfect storm from 2016, and it repeated itself. We had another storm almost identical to it in 2022 that resulted in winds going around a low pressure, pushing water northward out of Puget Sound toward the north, toward us. Winds were coming in from the west through the Strait of Juan de Fuqua, which pushed sea level up as well. Just the low pressure itself lifts the sea level, roughly about 2 feet to 2.5 feet. And so low pressure coming in just the right spot's going to, cause us some trouble. And gives you an idea of, this was in 2016. This is the predicted tide on March 10th. And then the green line was the actual tide. It was roughly 2.5 feet above the predicted high tide. And this was in 2022, December 27th. And it just showed the purple line is how much the tide was above what was predicted. It was 2.5 feet. So we had a 2.5 foot above the predicted tide level. And unfortunately, it occurred during a really high tide on top of that. And so the mixture of the perfect storm arriving during a king tide or a very high astronomical tide resulted in water overtopping some of the dikes in Skagit County. This is on the Sandwich Island Road. Actually, because I live on Sandwich Island, and I decided to stay home that day because I thought that the water might just get over the dikes, and it turned out it did. Which moves into, what's the risk of that becoming a bigger problem? Well, we have a relative sea level rise is going up for Skagit County. And so I have a chart here that is based on data from some folks at the University of Washington, Levine et al. In 2020, their most updated version. And so if you go out, 100 years into the future, there's a 85 to 96% chance that sea level will be 1 foot higher than it is today in Skagit County. There's a 28 to 50% chance it'll be 2.5 feet higher. So it kind of ranges on how things are going to go with greenhouse gases and how the Antarctic ice sheet behaves, what we might see in our area. And might not, by some people's perspective, might not seem like a lot that only 1 foot, but our drainage systems and our dikes and our stormwater systems will back up when you have the increased seawater. And so can be a game of inches, can have a pretty big impact. And then I kind of wrap up with kind of one of my geologic pet projects as a geologic hazard specialist is debris flows on alluvial fans. And it's an issue in a variety of locations where you're at the base of these steep mountains in Skagit County or up also in Whatcom County. And these really small creeks become conduits for debris flows or landslides that travel down the mountainside and then dump a lot of sediment abruptly and a lot of debris and trees onto the landscape down below. And it's a hazard that's maybe not as recognized as it should be, including amongst geologists. I've had some back and forth with DNR geologists over the hazards associated with alluvial fans and recognizing just how hazardous they really are. Unfortunately, in our wet forested climate, a lot of times the evidence goes away pretty quickly, but this was right after, about 3 months after one of these events happened. You can see there's no water flowing in the creek, and yet, you can see the scale of the flood that occurred from that debris flow as it came down. And this is another one that you can see where the trees that were growing along the creek actually stopped the debris from going any further. So, this road turned out safe, and, the car wasn't parked there. That's my car, but you can see the edge of the debris flow. And it's an issue that I really hope that Skagit County will take seriously in the future with as far as keeping people out of harm's way, because they're a really dangerous event. Anyway, I'll wrap up there, and I'd be glad to have any questions fed my way and see if I can answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was absolutely fascinating. I love the language that I come across in this presentation, like crystalline core and alluvial fan, and it's actually very lyrical. I'm going to have to Google some of those. Prograding delta, just beautiful. I may need to watch this a couple more times before I can confidently use that stuff in a sentence. But one question I wanted to ask, and I'm waiting for folks to put their questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I did want to say, or one question that I have is, if people are interested in learning more about geology, do you have any sort of go-to resources that you tend to point people to? I've heard a lot about this guy, Nick Zentner, who does a series called Nick on the Rocks that I think a lot of folks find interesting for a general audience. But is there anything else like that? Or if you think that one's not good, let me know. But
Yeah, Nick does a great job. It's
okay.
absolutely phenomenal, and he he's also does a good job with geologists as well, because he delves into subjects that maybe they don't know much about.
Oh, good.
It's really useful, and a lot of kind of reveals thinking out loud that goes on with science. Well, we don't know, and here's my interpretation. Here's somebody else's interpretation. So it's worthwhile. watching science, and he has quite a following, and he does great work. One, I'll just hold it up here, and is there's this book by Ned Brown. It's Mountain Building Geology in the Pacific Northwest, and it's about the North Cascades. And Ned did a tremendous amount of work there. The book's a bit on the technical side. It was published by Village Books up in Bellingham. So I don't know how available it is. He also did a book on the San Juan Islands, which has an overlap with Western Skagit County. And that one I think is generally available. I've seen that in a variety of stores. And it's a pretty understandable book. It's basic, and so some of the figures I had in my talk were derived from Ned's book.
Great, that is super helpful, and I will try to get those titles and email those out to people too in my follow-up email. If you want to go in and you can stop sharing, then folks can see you a little better as you talk or speak to their questions. I see a couple coming in the chat. Mike Olson asked, "What's the coolest fossil you've ever found in Skagit County?"
I think
have you found a
yeah,
lot of cool
no, the
fossils?
coolest
Oh,
fossil I was driving down Chuckanut Drive once, and there was a perfect palm frond that had fallen onto the road. And I drove a little further down, and I got out of the car and I slid it off the road, and then later on came back with a friend and we picked it up. So we needed a
wow.
cart to get it, and it was just such a beautifully intact palm frond. The other one that it wasn't in Skagit County, but it could have been, it was in Whatcom County, but it was the same formation that's in Skagit County. It was drilling into some glacial marine drift, which is when the glacial ice deposited sediment on the seafloor. As the glacial ice was floating above the water, is when the ice was thinning, and we drilled into a clam bed that was underneath it. So it was pulling clams out of the drill core. It's pretty fun to see those.
That's a great answer. Good question, Mike. Um, I have some people raising their hands as well. Wow, we've got lots of questions. Let's go with Cameron. What portion of the Skagit sediment load do you think is withheld by the Seattle City Light dams, and how is that impacting our watershed?
Oh, I don't know, but I would suspect it's probably in the order of somewhere 20%. Wouldn't surprise me. I do know there's a lot of sediment being just eroded from the terraces downstream of concrete. But I'm not familiar with the exact numbers. But you can see a real difference when you look at the Sauk River. It's full of glacial sediment because there's no dams on it. But there's also sediment held out of the dams coming off the Baker River as well, on the backside of Mount Baker. There's 2 dams there. So that'd be another place where sediment's being captured. But
Yeah, I
as far as
wondered.
quantitative numbers, I don't have, I'm not familiar with any
Yeah,
quantitative numbers.
well, I think that was a pretty good guess.
Yeah.
And then I wondered, you know, i- in terms of development in general, how development through dikes and all kinds of other things changes the natural flow of sediment. That's a really big general question, but I just wondered if you had any comments on it.
Yeah, it's playing a big role. The dikes on the Skagit, um, just south of the Swinomish Reservation, really they keep the river delta in that area pretty confined, and they go way out into the tideland, and so they're pushing sediment through that area faster than it otherwise would be. Otherwise, it would fill the channel up. And I do know that there's dredging has to occur there occasionally as well. And so that's having some effect where the sediment is being distributed, uh, kind of in the southern part of the delta there. And over time, that's going to change. But then sea level rise is going to have an impact as well, because as sea level rises, that slows the water flowing into the sea. And so the deposition of silt and clay is going to be further upstream than it otherwise would be.
Thank you. We have a bunch more questions, so I'm just going to rattle through them here. Hopefully, we'll have time for everything. Julie Tennis asked two questions. How did those deep rocks, 20 miles deep, the mantle rock, get to the surface, or how do we think they got there? And then the other question is, does the 3 foot inundation take into account the subsidence that will also occur during a local earthquake event?
Okay. Yeah. Uh, the first question is still being debated. The main way, though, would be that you could think of mountains as having roots. And so, in order to have a mountain, you have to have a lot of material down underneath it. But mountains are eroding as well. So, as they erode, that root then rises up. So, what had been buried deeply, as the mountain's being eroded, you have that isostatic uplift because the weight above it is removed. And so the faster the erosion rate, the quicker that material will come, or that deeply buried material will come in. So that's kind of the simple, broad answer for most deeply buried rocks rising. But there's some other components to that particularly deep buried area that was part of my master's thesis. And, you know, we had one theory, but there are competing theories that are just as equally valid. And I don't think it's worth going into the detail on that. Um, on the sea level rise, the values I gave, they do take into account uplift and subsidence is partly of why relative sea level is varies around Puget Sound and out on the Washington coast. Um, but they do not take into account any change of elevation from a major earthquake. Uh, in We're far enough from the Cascadia earthquake, though, that it probably wouldn't have much impact on the change of sea level right where we are. It's more of a problem where you go further out west toward the coastline.
Great, thank you. We have a question. I got a question from Bobby asking, does the Stewart Range have a common origin with the Chuckanets?
No. Yeah, the Mount Stewart Range is about a 90 million year old batholith that it's an igneous rock that is a magma chamber that solidified and then is uplifted. And then the Chuckanut is those rocks are around were deposited roughly about 50 million years ago. So the sediment source for the Chuckanut appears to be mostly from the Okanagan highlands to the east of what is now the Cascade Range. It's just based on the mineralogy. That's the way I understand it. And there might be a small input from Mount Stewart, but probably not very much. Mount Stewart area might have been buried under those kinds of sediments, and then subsequently, as it rose again with the next iteration that what's raising the Cascades now would have resulted in Mount Stewart batholith being exposed, and what rocks had been over the top of the all been eroded away. If that helps.
Yeah, it does. That's great. Ron asks, can you tell us the story of the Skagit Gorge above Newhelm? Hmm.
Uh, yeah, there's a really good PhD dissertation. I'm skipping his name right now. He did an incredibly good job. And it relates to the last ice age. And the Skagit River north of the gorge or upstream of the gorge before the last ice age probably flowed toward the north, not down the current Skagit Valley. There was a valley there, there was a Skagit Valley, but before the last ice age, but there was also a valley that headed to the north. But as the glacial ice came, continental glacial ice came down, it blocked off that northward flowing Skagit River and dammed it. And so then it spilled over to the south and carved that gorge. And then when the ice age ended, the gorge is still there, and it became a permanent restructuring of the drainage pattern of the upper Skagit River. And he worked for the National Park Service, and why am I forgetting his name? But he was a phenomenal job. He's got a PhD dissertation that he described that, and he really pieced together a pretty neat story. So it's a good question, and he asked himself that question, and that was how he figured out how he figured out, and then recognized that you had these glacial sediments that had dammed the northward flowing Skagit and sent it to where it is now.
We will try to track down the name of that dissertation and share that later on. And same
I
with
will
that book
say
title.
after this, I'll probably in the next week or two, we'll put the slideshow on my blog, Reading the Washington
Oh,
Landscape, and maybe
wonderful.
add some language to the slides from, instead of just showing the slides, maybe just a few descriptors and maybe, and that last question is actually something I was kind of thinking about addressing, and it's like, yeah, I left that out, but it's actually a pretty cool story.
Great. Well, we will point people to your blog for sure. And you might be able to, post a link to the recording as well of this session too. Ted Johnson wants to know, I noticed some prominent northwest southeast trends on the LIDAR on the Devil's Mountain Fault Slide and Skagit Flats LIDAR. Are those representative of the glacial flow direction or other?
That's the correct interpretation. Fantastic.
Hey.
Yeah. There's another web page that people could look at it, and I spent tons of time looking at it. So DNR LiDAR portal. If you want to look at those images, it's really easy to navigate. So it's called the DNR LiDAR portal, and those drumlins is what he was observing. Really stand out well in the LiDAR imagery. And just south of that area, it's really interesting because they curve eastward. It captures that ice flowing up the valley of the Still.
Great. We've got another good question here from Becky Cannon, who says, one of your slides grabbed my attention regarding the ancient blockage on the Skagit, Sauk, and Stillaguamish rivers. Does this account for the Stillaguamish having been part of the Skagit watershed?
I actually was writing down the name of the person who,
Oh, yeah, Becky
John
Cannon.
Rydell was the geologist who, with the National Park Service, who did the
Oh, yeah, and
look
he's
on the Skagit.
also, I think he's done a talk. He did a talk a year or two ago that I heard was good. So
Yeah,
he's
he
another
was doing a great
resource.
job. I'm sorry. So the last question was about the
Yeah,
Stillaguamish watershed and the Skagit.
yeah, the slide that showed the ancient blockage on the Skagit, Sauk, and Stillaguamish, and whether that accounts for the Stillaguamish having been part of the Skagit watershed.
Uh, the this it would have been linked together through that Sauk River passage. But there's a little twist to this. If you went back 7,000 years ago, after the Ice Age, the Sauk River flowed down what is now the Stillaguamish River. But when there was an eruption on Glacier Peak, this mud flows coming off Glacier Peak plugged the drainage from the Sauk down what is now the Stillaguamish, and the Sauk ended up diverted into the Skagit. But they were probably always linked in some manner because it didn't like suddenly carve a big channel through there. It was probably already a channel existing in this. The Sauk just took advantage of that after that eruption.
Thank you. We have another one for you. I know I'm just firing them off, but Barbara June wonders if she said she's seen your presentation about landslides, and do you ever repeat that presentation? I know you know, on the one hand, this was very therapeutic to start thinking about geological time because it moves so much slower than, my schedule, for example. And then on the other hand, I was like, oh, this is good motivation to go home and pack a bug out bag because there really are things like landslides and earthquakes and tsunamis to think about. So yeah, I haven't seen your presentation on landslides, but is that recorded anywhere or?
I don't know if any of them have been recorded. I gave quite a few talks on landslides post the Oso landslide.
Mhm.
Um, it actually was a really well-known landslide before it happened, and I just had a fair bit of background information about it even before it took place, so that it was kind of a hot subject, I guess, at the time. And so I gave probably gave 6 or 7 talks on that landslide, and then expanded into other landslides in the area and region. But yeah,
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye out for your next one if you do another one. Um, Ryan wonders, are the plateaus along the middle Skagit mostly deposited there by glaciers or the river or lahars?
mostly by the river, but when the river was backed up by the glacier. So if you think of the river being dammed by the glacier, so it would have changed the gradient of the river, and so there was a lot of sediment that piled up. And then those terraces have been subsequently eroded by them. That makes sense. So it was the damming of the river. And if you think about too, is that the amount of sediment coming down the river at that time, that was during the ice age, there would have been a lot less vegetation. The landscape was really raw. You had sediment coming out of glaciers into the Skagit River, so the flow of the river would have been very, very full of gravel, boulders, and a lot of sand and gravel would have resulted in the building up of the valley floor really substantially, a couple 100 feet in places, and then subsequently the river is eaten down through those old terrace sediments.
We've got another comment on a resource here. The Restless Northwest, a geological story by Hill Williams, is also an excellent book on the geology of the PNW. That comment is from Brad Solomon. Are you familiar with that text?
No, I'm not.
Well, I'll include that in my email out to folks. I'll include that title. Um, Michael asks, is there landform evidence, LIDAR, of the ice sheet having advanced upriver in the Skagit?
Yes, you can see it in the drumlins, or those kind of striations that the glacier left behind. You can see that it turns up the valley, and they're heading up valley of some of the glacial flow. And then there's evidence of it coming down the valley too, so that you can sort of pick the spot where the two ice fields met. And John Rydell has a really good description of that as well.
Thank you. Thomas Horton says, hiking around the coastal regions, including the San Juan Islands, you encounter a lot of very deep and steep canyons and cliffs oriented more or less northwest southeast. I have assumed these deep gouges were created by ice. Is that correct?
Uh, they may have been enhanced by the ice flow, but you also remember that there would have been water flowing underneath the ice. And so that could also be a source of the erosion, which can be as very, very erosive. You think about these 5,000 feet of ice and then water flowing underneath that ice, it's going to be under a tremendous amount of pressure and very erosive. And then it may also be carrying a lot of sand and gravel, so it's eating whatever the water's flowing through.
All right, these are such good questions, and
Yeah, they're challenging.
I'm impressed that you can field all of them as well. Uh, okay, Kari and Bob ask, what do you think the most significant geologic changes will be to this area in the next geologic period, whatever that is? And we have a comment, the Anthropocene, which
Uh,
is
Um,
a word that I've heard pronounced different ways, so I'm not sure how you
Anthropocene,
pronounce
yeah,
it, but
yeah.
yeah.
Uh, I I kind of split between a big volcanic eruption coming off of Glacier Peak, having a pretty pronounced effect in Skagit County, and then the other one being the relative sea level rise, and then how we as a society deal with that relative sea level rise with the outer part of the delta where farmland it starts getting hard to do drainage with, and how we work on that. It's already presenting some challenges in the here and now, and that challenge is only going to get a little tougher for parts of Skagit County.
All right, thank you. We have a resource posted. Ryan Walters posted that I think one of the papers that you referred to by John Riddell. It's a PDF. It might be a book. Um,
Yeah, it's readily
and
available through
mhm,
his PhD dissertation, and then I think he
mhm.
published a paper in a journal as well.
And then Cindy Bjorklund says, in addition to John Rydell, physical geologist at North Cascades, Rob Burrows completed a dissertation and amazing research on the geology of the Middle Skagit near the Goodell and New Halem areas. Some more good names and resources here. Um, Lynn Wenberg says, I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. What books or technical reports would you recommend for novices to grow our knowledge?
I think if you're into the bedrock, the Ned Brown's book on the Cascades will stretch your brain. So uh,
Okay.
I think it's a good source if you really want to dig into it. That's the mountain building geology of the Pacific Northwest. It's kind of almost a summation of his career. And it kind of touches, I just touched briefly on his, the in Skagit County and the Northwest Washington it's a fantastic place to work as a geologist because there is a lot here that is really challenging, uh, and a lot we still don't know. And I think it's one of the fun things about my work is, I might have a focus on one thing and I'm solving one problem, but I'll see something as like, what is that? And trying to figure out and get it and explain it is, and sometimes not knowing and not being able to figure it out. There's still a mystery. It's really one of the neat things about working in this area. There's a lot we don't know.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. We have had a very lively Q&A session. I don't see anything else popping up right at the moment, so I'm going to take this opportunity to just mention a few upcoming events that we have. Um, but I just want to again thank you for sharing this incredible wealth of knowledge, and I'm really excited to have your expertise available to us and to the community in the way that it now is with this recording. So we'll be sharing this on our YouTube channel, so folks can rewatch it, and they'll also be emailed out to everyone who registered, including those that weren't able to make it into the Zoom tonight. Um, the speaker series runs all the way through May. So there are a few other presentations coming up. January 15th, we've just confirmed a speaker on the topic of conservation burial. This is with funeral director Anna Jordan from Kern's Funeral Home, which is actually our direct neighbor here in Mount Vernon. And so she'll be talking about a whole range of interesting green burial approaches and um, preferences that people can have, the range of choices people have. So that's January 15th. I also want to mention some immediately upcoming events. Unfortunately, our wreath making on Sandwich Island on this December 7th is already full, but there is a wait list. December 16th, we're going to have a holiday open house at our office. So folks can just drop in for a dessert and a hot drink and, just to chat with staff and other members and um, just a casual social get together there. And specific times and everything are on our website. I didn't try to fit everything on the slide, but you can just go to skagitlandtrust.org and we'll also send that information out in e-news and on our social media. We also have volunteer opportunities coming up. This Friday, there's a trail maintenance work party up at Bar Creek. So we're still looking for more folks for that. You can sign up on our website. And we also have another work party coming up at Tope Ryan on December 18th. And I think I will post into the chat like a few of our links, like our Eventbrite page and things like that, in case people who are newer to us want to go in and find us that way. But I just want to say thanks again to Dan and to all of our members and volunteers, partners, landowners, everybody that helps the trust do what it does. This is really a wonderful chance for us to gather together. And I would encourage folks to keep an eye out for in-person get-together opportunities. We know that people often prefer that. And so we do offer lots of little events on the land and then some bigger events, usually in the summer when the weather's more predictable. So if you're not already on our mailing list, go to our website and get on there. And yeah, I'll send a follow-up email with the recording and some of these resources. That would probably be early next week. So thanks again, everybody, and thank you, Dan. It's very clear that everyone found this incredibly engaging, and it's always fun to be able to be a technical an expert in your field and be able to share it, be able to share things in a way that gets other people excited who might not have a background in this field. So wonderful job, and thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah.
We will see you next time.
Good night.
Good night.